Is it? Yeah, now it's working. Good. Your Excellencies, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to address you this morning on the topic of the first panel, what we have learned from the migrant crisis. As you know, we have now seen an increasing flow of refugees through Serbia, as was mentioned by the previous speakers, for more than 6 months. So there is quite a number of lessons which we can draw from this experience, and I would like to outline some. And I hope I will be thought-provoking and provocative enough to stimulate a very good discussion of the eminent panelists we have here. Over the last few years, we've seen a staggering escalation of displacement caused by conflict. Since 2010, the number of people forced to flee daily as a result of conflict and persecution nearly quadrupled. Today, there's more than 60 million people, persons like you and me, forcibly displaced by war or persecution, more than at any time since World War II. Only from Syria, as you know, 4.4 million people are displaced as refugees in the neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, and almost 8 million Syrians are displaced inside their country. Then there's all conflicts or persecution in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Eritrea, Mali, Sudan, I mean, you name it. By the end of this year, 1 million asylum seekers will have reached Europe, and several thousand will have perished on their way on the sea. And it is dramatic. And this morning again, I saw the latest pictures on the news of families with small children traveling over rocky, wintry seas in little dinghies which take water, and there needs to be a rescue at sea for them. This definitely is a situation which has become untenable. Even though this is the biggest refugee movement affecting Europe for decades, it's not unprecedented or unique. Europe has seen large movements of refugees during and after the Second World War, during the second half of the 20th century, from Hungary, from Czechoslovakia, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, of the Soviet Union. So why do we talk about the refugee crisis now? 1 million people for Europe, is this so significant? Why? What is the difference of this situation? What can we learn from it to manage this crisis and future refugee crisis better? How can we prevent a movement of 1 million people, which is not a huge movement, globally speaking, from being turned into a crisis or being labeled a crisis? This is mainly a refugee crisis. 90% of all those who arrived in Europe this year, this 1 million, are from refugee-producing countries such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and a few others. Actually, those who are transiting Serbia and are being registered here, 96% come from refugee-producing countries. And this is also borne witness by the high recognition rate of them as refugees once they reach the countries of destination in Northern and Western Europe. So, of course, there is a number of non-refugees amongst the flow. But what we have seen, and this is there is very firm empirical evidence of this, including in the official figures published by the government of Serbia, is that whereas the number of migrants, economic, irregular, however you call them, have stayed steady, the number of refugees have greatly increased over the last 12 months. This is why it is a refugee movement. And we also see that they're using different routes. Those asylum seekers who enter Serbia from Macedonia are different to those who enter Serbia from Bulgaria. Whereas the ones who enter from Macedonia don't need the help of smugglers and criminals. They can move more orderly and better protected. Those who enter from Bulgaria invariably need the help of criminals and smuggling networks. And they're mainly young single men, whereas from the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, we see many more women and children coming. So we have to question ourselves, why do we talk about a migration crisis? And this is my first remark to this, the theme of this panel. Is it a migration crisis? No, not really. It's a refugee crisis. Actually, it's wrong to call it a migration crisis, and it is dangerous because it creates a smokescreen which plays into the hands of demagogues, of extremists. And we have seen that being used and abused again and again. So let's talk about the facts as they are and talk about it as a mixed flow which is dominated by refugees. And so we talk about refugees and migrants, but clearly a big majority of the people moving have a need for international protection and they're entitled to it. Labeling them as migrants doesn't help anybody. And it actually plays in the hands of those who will make the management more difficult. The second lesson we have learned from the situation is that we have to combine old and new tools and approaches. All of us who work together, the UN agencies and other stakeholders, very dynamic and fast situation. You know, there's the different models, camp refugees, urban refugees. Now we had a very stimulating, also intellectually and operationally, challenge of what we call refugees on the move, which calls for a completely different operational response. The intensity and speed of the movement further, reinforced or related to globalization was new, as was the constant flow of people. So this has led to innovation, creativity, and pragmatism by governments, humanitarian actors, in the design and implementation of the responses, the protection and humanitarian responses. I don't want to go into detail, but of course you are all aware about the important role of social media in the current situation, of mobile teams who can follow the refugee flow, of 24 presence, which we haven't had before in refugee crisis, that there is a need for a 24/7 presence because people are constantly on the move. For lightweight relief items, which the refugees can carry with them, take with them, and so on and so on. The third lesson, of course, is nothing new. The importance of a coordinated and comprehensive response. Now, this is not necessarily an easy task in Europe, which has, limited experiences. And as with the use of technology, I myself was surprised by, the little use or possibility for use of technology in Europe after I worked for 20 years in Africa and Asia with refugees. When I came back to Europe, how little technology is being used here and how much we have to advance the use of technology to respond. In Africa, you provide assistance to refugees by cash transfers through SMS messages. This is something which unfortunately nowadays is still unthinkable in Europe. So the same with coordination and comprehensive approaches. We have seen comprehensive approaches. When I started working for UNHCR, it was the Comprehensive Plan of Action with the Vietnamese boat people in Asia in the early 90s or late 80s, early 90s. That was a comprehensive, coordinated approach. Now, I think that Europe still has some learning curve here. Serbia has set up in June early on an interministerial working group, and together with our partners in the UN system and civil society, we have rolled out what is called the refugee coordination model to assist the government in its coordination of the approach. Now, the humanitarian action, we've learned, we know, is there to fill gaps and to support the lead of the state in the response. It's the state's responsibility to assist and protect these people. The states are bound by the international conventions, not the UN agencies or the humanitarian actors. We are just there to support the states in fulfilling this responsibility. So a strong state is vital, and we pride ourselves of having Serbia, supported Serbia in being strong, in taking the lead. So humanitarians shouldn't create a parallel system. They cannot replace the state, and they should not. But humanitarian action needs to be complemented by developmental and financial support. There is still the issue of, who is going to cover the running costs of the facilities. Are the humanitarian agencies, will they continue to fund food for the refugees, fuel for the heating? Is this not an area where the government should receive budgetary support, staffing of government actors? This question that there needs to be a comprehensive approach which combines humanitarian, developmental and financial support has been prominent here in Belgrade since July, I would say. And it has also hampered a little bit the response. And it meant that some of the actions which we wanted to take together with the government in summer were delayed. So there I think we have to make progress on finding a true comprehensive response and support to the states, not only on the humanitarian side, which can be flexible and fast, but on all areas that are needed. The fourth lesson we learned is that a truly humane and adequate management of the effects of the crisis requires strong states acting together in solidarity. Now, and of course, that the current crisis does not put in question the established international protection regime for refugees, but actually validates it. Now, recently we've seen a big increase, I mentioned already, in families and children amongst the refugees, as well as elderly, disabled, and persons with specific needs. Why is that? What does that tell us? I think it is a positive development because it shows that we have been successful in supporting states in providing a safer environment for the refugees. As I mentioned, those who come with smugglers and criminals might be young men, but the families, the elderly, the disabled, they come in a bigger number because it's safe and safer for them to come. How comes? Because we have a strong state managing, not leaving the space free for criminals to fill the void. And that is very important. We've seen it here. You saw the immediate positive impact of the changes to the legislation in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And I'm very happy to see the ambassador of the Republic of Macedonia here who can talk more about that. Because immediately when the asylum seekers were legalized in Macedonia, the exploitation of them stopped. You remember the terrible media reports about exploitation of them on the territory of Macedonia. This has stopped immediately when the government took strong, decisive action and legalized their stay. And this was the same approach which we've seen in Serbia and for which we have been praising Serbia, rightly so. The registration in Serbia is stronger than in some EU member states. Serbia has provided unhindered access to its territory and to asylum procedures. And it has not detained the asylum seekers or deterred their entry. Now, individual states that react differently, that close the borders to refugees, that systematically detain all asylum seekers and mistreat them as a deterrent measure, they do not only violate the most basic human rights of extremely vulnerable people. As you know, refugees are defined as those people who need international protection because they don't have national protection. But these states, they also shift the burden of care to other states. And, of course, they violate their obligations under international, European, and national law. When we see detention, deterrent measures, closures of borders, we immediately see that this pushes the refugees into the hands of criminals and smugglers, traffickers, and makes them vulnerable to exploitation. As I mentioned, Serbia has reacted positively, and this was possible also because I believe the public opinion in Serbia has been positive. Many citizens of Serbia understand the refugee experience. Civil society has been very active and supportive, very strong. The government has been unwavering in a positive response. And unless other governments, it has been steady. And it has reacted immediately when the issue was at risk of being exploited by demagogues, and has spoken out in defense of the refugees. Publicly, at the highest level, the Prime Minister, not so long ago, again and again. About a month ago, after the terrible terrorist attacks in Paris, Prime Minister Vučić, together with High Commissioner Guterres, visited the reception center in Preševo, and they made a point that refugees are not terrorists, but the first victims of this. Many are fleeing terrorism, and it was not the refugee movement that created terrorism. It was terrorism together with tyranny, with war, that have created the refugee movements. And the Prime Minister of Serbia was even stronger on that day in these statements than the High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres. If and when the international refugee protection regime, including protection-sensitive border and migration management systems, are fully and properly implemented, they provide the tools exactly to avoid that economic migrants or possible terrorists, other criminals, piggyback on refugee flows. And we have seen that here very much. And that's why our support to a good registration, a good security check by the Serbian authorities is vital to make the European system work. The fifth lesson that we learned is that more action has to be taken to tackle the causes of forced displacement in countries of origin, but also in countries of first asylum and in countries of transit. I'm not telling you anything new if you followed the discussion. We have long asked for systematic, orderly resettlement of refugees from the countries neighboring Syria to Europe and other states. And a year ago, there was a project started in Lebanon, and unfortunately many states reacted very timidly, which is one of the reasons why we now talk about a crisis. How can it be that in the Europe of the 21st century, refugees have to irregularly cross dozens of borders, many on foot, literally stuck in the mud, in the rain, in the cold, in the heat? This is not the Europe of the 21st century, which we like to live in. It reminds us of the pictures which were shown at the opening of this conference. So more needs to be invested in making protection effective in countries of first asylum. And there have been huge funding shortfalls for the humanitarian response there, but also support to the countries, the governments in the countries of first asylum, to allow refugees to work, to have access to education there, and so on. In addition, we need increased solidarity in resettling refugees from there with generous quotas. There also need to be more generous legal avenues for family unification and other forms of immigration, in addition to refugee resettlement. It is disappointing, of course, that now some European states instead want to limit family reunification, which if I may say so, to me is a bit like a populist knee-jerk reaction to the situation, because it will aggravate the situation rather than solving it. You remember that much attention to the crisis was drawn by the terrible case of the Kudi family, who lost their children in sea. And this is also an example of a family which had applied for resettlement, for orderly transfer, were denied, and then took to the boats. So I think we need to have an orderly system of assisting refugees, and this is laid out in international law. It's nothing new, and it has been implemented elsewhere in the world, as well as in Europe in the past. So in addition to supporting Greece, Europe needs a comprehensive plan for managing the arrival of asylum seekers in a safe and orderly way. That means also operating beyond Europe's borders, as of course it is much less disruptive and expensive or more humane to maintain asylum seekers closer to in their present locations instead of forcing them to move through the mud irregularly across borders, green borders. Last but not least, of course, when you look at the general displacement figures which I quoted, there we see many new crises breaking out without any of the old ones getting resolved. This clearly illustrates the lack of capacity and political will to end conflict, let alone prevent it. And the result is an alarming proliferation of unpredictability and impunity, which leads to forced displacement and the situation we have now. So the 6 lessons, and the last one, is that multilateralism, international solidarity, and cooperation has to be strengthened to tackle the root causes as well as the symptoms of forced displacement. When we interview the refugees here, they all give very good reasons why they're here. They tell us about what happened to them at home and why they had to flee. But they also tell us about the hardship they endure on the journey. They're very nervous, they're in a rush. They are in despair and hope at the same time. And some of the deterrent measures we've seen in Europe have actually aggravated the situation because it have made the refugees to rush even more before another border is closed. At the same time, we are reminded that root causes need to be addressed. As long as we have this conflict so close to Europe, in a globalized world, refugees will have to continue to come to Europe. So, of course, there has to be renewed, constant efforts in the United Nations Security Council, but also regional mechanisms to create political solutions to conflicts, and then to massively support reconciliation and reconstructions to make these solutions sustainable. We've seen a large movement of refugees and migrants into Europe, and we understand that the only way of tackling is that states act together. Undoubtedly, we've seen, at least initially, a lack of solidarity, of speed, blatant violation even of most basic European standards in registration, border management, reception, and access to rights. We see a lack of enforcement mechanisms to uphold those standards. All of that has aggravated the situation and led to the crisis, as it's called a crisis now. Now, solidarity is of course needed, and it cannot be that 2-3 European countries receive all the refugees, while other countries refuse to receive refugees, prefer to be inhospitable, or prefer to remain transit countries forever without any steps taken to turn them into countries of destination as well. In a time of globalization, rapid mobility, it cannot be that we have a lot of regional mechanisms to harmonize agriculture, consumer rights, regional structural subsidies, and so on. But we have individual states, ministries of interior, to maintain a monopoly on important fundamental European values such as asylum. A truly workable and effective harmonized European asylum system is where countries of destination and transits work together is needed. And I will stop now before finishing the whole speech and just summarize. We have seen a crisis which stems from a crisis of European values, which has been attested to by many European leaders. But the common roots of the UN system, as mentioned before, and the international refugee protection system after World War II are the same as the roots of the European institutions and the European architecture. The traumatic experiences of the Holocaust, of all the displacement in Europe, have created these institutions together, and they share the same fundamental basis. They come together, and we have to help them to come together again. And this is not only a lofty goal, but it's also practical, because it will allow us to defend states, citizens from the threat of terrorism, from irregular movement and crime. So, I think that our experience of the past few months, watching different states, how they react, and bilateral mechanisms being developed, including between Serbia and Croatia, has confirmed that when there is political will, there is a way to prevent and alleviate human suffering. So this refugee crisis can be managed and will be managed next year if there is sufficient will, and I hope that some of the lessons we have learned, which I tried to present to you, will be fully implemented and drawn upon. Thank you very much for your attention.